So I can't even pretend anymore that I have any hope left for the entire planet. It just seems like my entire life has been growing up just watching the most terrible things happen. And since like 2019, I've been in like full on doomer mode, which has just gotten worse and worse. And it's like, you know, just seeing all that footage of Israel destroying a hospital, potentially 1,000 people dead. And it's just like, the whole of the Western countries' governments, EU, UK, opposition parties, doesn't matter. They were all egging on Israel this entire time, literally egging on Israel to complete its own version of Manifest Destiny, which people don't understand. Like, this is what they want to do. They want this all for themselves. There's no like rational logic behind it beyond just colonialism. And if you view what's going on the same way you viewed the settlement of America, the colonialism of America by European settlers, then you'll get a good insight into what's happening right now. And it's just like, I just I just watch this stuff and I'm just pretty like just so black pilled. It's just terrible to see this stuff, and it's so radicalizing. I said this before, but I thought I'd try and still help, I guess, in some ways. And I thought today maybe I'd try and explain why so many British people support Israel. And I want to go through like my own history of why I used to support Israel. Not as like, oh my god, it's the best country ever, but if I have to choose, I'll choose Israel because of a multitude of reasons. But for me personally, it was more to do with atheism, which sounds weird when we're talking about like a country founded by, to be fair, a lot of atheists, but also a lot of religious Zionists as well. Um, so yeah, I'm just going to talk about all that today. It might be a bit rambly. I really don't have any structure. I have no notes. It's just off the top of my head. But I was tweeting about this the other day and someone was asking me questions and I thought, why don't I make a video? Why don't I explain why or how British people are conditioned to support the state of Israel? So one thing that's very different about Israel in UK politics until about the last 7 years is you don't grow up hearing loads about it. Like, I was raised Catholic, went to Catholic primary, secondary school, was an altar server. The most I heard about Israel was just from like biblical scripture. And none of that was done in the service of trying to make me support the modern state of Israel. Like, I was pretty unaware of what Israel even was growing up. Like, I don't remember when I first heard of it. It was probably through my obsession with World War II history as like a older kid and young teenager. But honestly, it's not like US politics where because of Christian Zionism, there's such a massive emphasis on supporting Israel by both parties for, different reasons. So we didn't really have that. So I can't say that British people by and large are raised as children to think Israel is amazing. I don't think most children my age, or in terms of, when we were children in the 90s and early 2000s, we didn't really learn about it. Now, I was talking to one of my friends who's a primary school teacher, and he says he actually teaches about it now. So that's probably a change in the curriculum, but I never knew about it growing up. My first exposure to Israel, I think, properly was the 2006 war with Lebanon, or Hezbollah, between Israel. But in my head, I didn't understand what I was watching because I was a bit of a weird kid. I used to get up like maybe at 6 a.m. every day so I could watch 2 hours of the news. And that's because I was absolutely obsessed with like war as like a kid, war history. So I'd get up to watch like the news coverage of the wars in Afghan and Iraq, right? Because I just love this stuff as like a 10-year-old or maybe a bit younger. And then I do remember this war of Lebanon, but in my head it all just morphed into one. Like, what am I even watching here? Is it just like the war on terror still? And we're going to get back to that because that is in essence how a lot of us in the UK have been conditioned to see Israel-Palestine. Oh, it's just an extension of the US versus X, Y, and Z Islamic insurgent group. It's just the West versus backwards barbaric Islam. And in that world, well, who do you pick? Do you pick barbaric Islam or do you pick lovely Western values, LGBT friendly and very progressive, right? That's the way it's been framed. But even as a kid, 11, 12 years old, I didn't understand. And I'm watching that and it all just gets thrown in like this like xenophobia soup where I don't know the difference between them. And I don't even think most adults would know the difference between like Hamas and the Taliban. So that was like my first exposure to it. And honestly, I can't tell you in my school we were taught specifically that Israel is a great country. Like, I honestly really don't remember ever being taught about Israel in school. But I do remember being taught a lot about secularism. I do remember watching Richard Dawkins going to like Islamic schools and showing how like ignorant they were. And I grew up in London during the War on Terror era. So we had stuff like 7/7. We had all these threats of things happening to us. So what I'm trying to say is, although I wasn't taught about Israel in school, I did grow up in a very xenophobic society during a time where Muslims were demonized like crazy. And I've made a lot of videos talking about like my political evolution, my upbringing. I don't think I was raised particularly racist beyond, the general racism that comes of growing up, as a white guy in a racist white society, because I'm obviously from a migrant background. I went to Catholic school with loads of people from migrant backgrounds. I don't think I was ever indoctrinated in like proper racism, but I will say I was indoctrinated in Islamophobia, which is this racialized version of Islam. And I think in that's what made me more attracted to new atheism. And I think this is where Israel comes in. Because like I said, I don't even think I really had much of an opinion on Israel, because I didn't know much about it beyond the legacy of World War II. So when I'm 18, 19, I'm more attracted to new atheism, but it's obviously in a period of Islamophobia. So what they're talking about mainly when I'm attracted to it, not like the mid-2000s or the Bush era when it's all about evangelical Christianity, it's all about Islam. So I'm, dealing with my own religion, and I'd been like an atheist for a couple years at this point, and then I'm watching Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, they seem pretty reasonable, saying all this stuff about all religions, and I'm listening to them and like, they make great points. And then I watch like Christopher Hitchens, and he talks about like Islam as well. Ironically, I didn't watch much of his stuff on Israel, which is funny because that might have changed my mind early on. So in my head, I'm thinking, religion is the biggest danger in the world. Religion is the biggest danger to humanity. It's the biggest problem with humanity is religion. Look at all the problems it causes. And in that, at this current time, the most dangerous of all of them is Islam. So in that, I view the Israel-Palestine conflict in a certain way. And it's, well, a lot of the stuff Israel do is bad, but Hamas is equally to blame. And I remember, this is really funny, my evolution. I remember I wrote something for my university paper, essentially saying there could never be peace in the region because of Hamas. And why I wrote that is because I had this Iranian professor who taught me Islamicism. And we were taught this whole subject about political Islam, very interesting. But I was taught by a guy who fled the Islamic Revolution. And a lot of Iranians before that did actually support Israel. And a lot of secular Iranians have supported Israel because they hate Islamicism, right? Even today this happens. So I was taught by this one guy. I was into new atheism. So in my head, Islamicism is just the worst thing ever. Ever. So I remember I wrote this article, obviously got like a fair bit of pushback. And then it made me start questioning my beliefs a bit more and thinking about like my own like racism, obviously, towards, a stereotypical Muslim, let's say. And I was realizing more and more, like, maybe I am wrong about this, right? And it's hard when you're a kid, when you're a centre-left, contrarian 19-year-old, to think you can ever say anything that's ignorant or wrong. But I started questioning it more and more. And Sam Harris supports Israel because of the logic I've described you, right? He thinks, well, what Israel is doing is bad, but a secular home for the Jews, the only democracy in the Middle East, LGBT friendly compared to other countries in the region, well, that's a good thing. And if we view everything through Western chauvinism, Western supremacy, then we want more countries like Israel. We want less countries like Palestine, because those backwards Muslims, how could we ever trust them? Look at all these societies they've created. Look at Iran. Look at Saudi Arabia. Look at all these places. And obviously, because I was a dumbass 18, 19-year-old who was into new atheism, I never really made a capitalist analysis of the world. So I didn't realise a lot of my issues with religion stemmed from a capitalist status quo, where some of the worst religious societies, like Saudi Arabia, are propped up by the West, right? And can get away with this fundamentalist religion because of capitalism. Alternatively, some of the most fundamentalist areas in the world in terms of religion are also some of the poorest areas that live under authoritarian regimes which are propped up by the West for capitalism and geopolitics, right? But as an 18, 19-year-old, I couldn't make that analysis because I was just too stupid, and I was doing a humanities degree rather than doing a political science, and, you know, the economic analysis was missing. So in that, I supported Israel. But then what is very interesting, and I remember this, so I told you, I wrote this article about Hamas and stuff. And a year later, I wrote a completely different article about weaponized anti-Semitism in the UK. And this is where it started to rear its ugly head, because I was this contrarian leftist. I didn't like Jeremy Corbyn when he initially broke onto the scene and, like, became the leader of the Labour Party. I was like, I like his ideas in some ways, but he's too naive. This is the real world, you know, all this peace and love crap. That won't help. And I remember he launched some sort of investigation into anti-Semitism, and he talked about how if we're going to say that Muslims aren't responsible for the actions of Islamic insurgent groups, because they're not, you know, Jews are not responsible for the actions of the Israeli state. And then immediately they started calling him an anti-Semite for that. And even though at the time I kind of supported Israel over Palestine, I was thinking, hang on a moment, this is weird. Why are they conflating these two things? Because as an atheist, I knew Israel was founded by atheists and has been getting more religious in terms of the dominant strain of Zionism since the 60s. So I'm like, Jewish people don't automatically support Zionism. So how can you call Jeremy Corbyn an anti-Semite for pointing that out? So then I started to realise that, you know, there's something fishy going on here where they're trying to conflate Zionism with Judaism. And then that's pretty much where it started to break into my brain about just like how I've been conditioned to support Israel. And then in terms of my own political evolution, Brexit happens, proper radicalizing for me, seeing this like racist, xenophobic campaign winning, shattered a lot of my illusions about Britain being somewhat redeemable in terms of like liberal values or something. Really shattered a lot of my like underlying Western chauvinism. And then thankfully Jeremy Corbyn did very well in the 2017 election. He could have actually won if his own party didn't actually, you know, undermine him every step of the way. And then from there, it really ramped up. The hysteria around Jeremy Corbyn allegedly being an anti-Semite because he was against Israel was absolutely insane. And to any rational person, even if you thought of yourself as some sort of centrist, leftist or whatever, or centre-left contrarian like myself, you're just like, this is crazy what they're doing. Like, you can support Israel and realise Jeremy Corbyn sticking up for the Palestinians does not make him an anti-Semite. And I think from there, even though I was, you know, actually becoming a communist at this point as well, I was like, holy shit, like, they're not even trying to hide how they're trying to conflate both these terms together. And in my head, it really broke me out of the illusion that, oh, we should support Israel because it's some sort of beacon of morality, some sort of beacon of, I don't know, anything good. Because I realised how the Israeli lobby and the Conservatives and right-wing Labour Zionists were all attacking Jeremy Corbyn based on the fact he wanted to stick up for Palestinians. And back then I supported a two-state solution and I agreed what Israel were doing was bad, the illegal settlements and stuff. But then this really turned me against Israel watching this. And then something, dialing it back a tiny bit to a couple of years before, growing up in London, I convinced myself more than I should have that Britain was a redeemable country, right? 'Cause London is very different to the rest of the UK. And I think with Brexit, it really like shattered part of my identity that had any association with being English. I don't know if people would relate to this in any way, but you guys will know because I talk about it all the time. I am from like pretty much exclusively an Irish background, like tracing back my family history, centuries, it's just all Irish. I don't know, maybe before I could be from somewhere else, but you know, we know where our ancestral homeland is and everything like that in parts of Ireland where our family have been for, you know, absolutely ages. And then I started to realise, you know, as I got older, I was 20 at this point, started to talk to more of my family members about, you know, the struggles against the English from my Irish family, and I started to more associate with my Irish part of my identity, which sounds weird considering I did grow up in a very Irish Catholic, like, school and everything, like that was a dominant migrant group there. And in that, I started to obviously identify more of the struggle against colonialism as well. That, Irish people have always been pretty pro-Palestine and everything. And I think really embracing that part of my own identity helped. But Brexit steered me in that direction because I realised all this racism and xenophobia they're using against European migrants, Muslims, these are the same types of arguments that were used against people like my grandparents when they came to England in the 40s and 50s, right? And I'd be stupid to ignore that part of my own family history to keep pretending this country isn't extremely xenophobic just because I'm accepted now as like a white person, appears English to everyone, obviously from an Irish background too. So in that, I started to become more sympathetic with like independence movements. Thankfully, with my history degree, my last year learning about the Vietnam War, then transitioning with my master's degree straight afterwards to doing like political economy of the Middle East, doing just loads of stuff about US foreign policy, it made me really realize the reality of what Israel has always been. And I really had to do some like introspection about my own self and my own identity to realize like who I have to stand with. And this atheism that I had that led me to support Israel was super naive. Just like, no excuse for supporting Israel just because I was an atheist. And thankfully, with Brexit, it shifted my entire political outlook. It really did shatter the Western chauvinism within me, which I'm very happy about. And like I said, the hysteria around Jeremy Corbyn being called an anti-Semite really solidified how dishonest people who supported Israel would be. But then one more thing to note is, why a lot of people are silent on Israel in the UK, they're absolutely terrified of being called an anti-Semite, which has been so dangerous. Every major political figure in this country is responsible for this environment, and I'll tell you why it's bad. If you keep conflating Zionism with Judaism, when Israel does something bad, people think that is some sort of representative of the religion, right? And if you are like Ben Shapiro saying that every Jewish person who doesn't completely step in line with the government of Israel, like Bernie Sanders, he called Bernie Sanders not a real Jew because he's not 100% on board with the Netanyahu government. Bernie Sanders supports Israel, by the way, but just because he's not 100% on board with Netanyahu, Ben Shapiro says he's not a real Jew. And then you have Keir Starmer, who basically has not said anything bad about Israel since he's become Labour leader. He's saying anti-Zionist anti-Semitism, conflating the two terms together. And like I said, why that's so dangerous is if you keep telling people these things are the same, people don't realise they're different. So when people are getting angry at what Israel are doing, again, if you're super ignorant, you're just going to think, oh, it's the whole religion. It's the whole of these people. They support this. This is the true face of Judaism, is it? What's happening today in Palestine, that is the face of Judaism. It's a really stupid thing to do, but that's why people are terrified of criticising Zionism. And also, fun thing, there's organisations in the UK, like there are in the US, that go around trying to get you fired from your job. I had someone message my boss calling me a racist because I wrote an article about how Israel weren't sending Gaza ventilators to treat COVID patients. Literally tried to get me fired for writing that. Thankfully, my boss didn't, because they could see like everything I wrote was actually true. But they were actually messaging my work to get me fired. And that's just the environment. Like, everyone is tiptoeing around. And the only reason Jeremy Corbyn has been so strong on the Palestine stuff recently is because they literally kicked him out of the party for allegedly being an anti-Semite, right? It's absolutely insane. And also, thanks to my international relations masters and just reading more books about Israel, I realised how pivotal Israel has been to US foreign policy since after the 6-Day War, when they realised, oh, hang on, this country has a pretty good army, actually. So let's 100% support it, because back in the day, it was mainly France and Britain. But after the 6-Day War, because the US was involved in Vietnam, they're like, we don't want to get in a war in the Middle East as well. So Israel, you did pretty well against all those Arab countries. Why don't we just chuck all this money behind you instead? You can be our proxy. And Joe Biden even saying in the 90s that if it didn't exist, we'd have to invent it because it serves our interests so well. So yeah, all of those things for me burst the bubble that, about Israel. And thankfully, multiple things led me to sympathizing, identifying, whatever you want to call it, with the Palestinians, and just realizing that their Islamist factions like Hamas are a response to the occupation, not that all Muslims crazy and bad. Because that is genuinely how stupid I was back in the day, that I let that kind of thinking even infect me. And then you realise, when you read more about it, the reason Hamas even got into power in the first place is because they felt like the PLO and Fatah had sold them out to the Israelis. Being like, you've conceded a lot of our struggle for getting back Palestinian land to the Israelis. And even, I remember reading, it said Palestinian Christians living in Gaza, even some of them voted for Hamas. And you're like, why would they do that? That sounds insanely dangerous. And it's because they were sick of the status quo, which the PLO, Fatah, the Palestinian Authority, was enabling. So they're like, well, who's fighting back? Oh, this group is. And when you're this Western chauvinist atheist, you don't realise why people would support groups who might completely go against their own views on religion. And when you start reading more about independence movements against colonialism, you realise this is pretty common, that people will often support a group that are fighting back just because they're fighting back. Not that they 100% believe in everything that group's doing. Like, you see it with the Vietnam War a lot, because Ho Chi Minh positioned himself as a nationalist first and a communist second. And you had a lot of people in the NLF, although often got, a broad education on Marxism, not all of them did. And they were fighting because the Southern Vietnamese government and the Americans treated them terribly. They didn't really need to learn every nuance about communism and stuff, right? And it's the same in Palestine, is they're just supporting the group fighting back. And people at the moment fighting, they've lived under Hamas governance since they were literal 4-year-olds, some of them. Some of those people fighting today would have never known anything different than them in control and Israel doing increasingly terrible things to them. So it's not surprising they're going to join them. Like I said that in my video last week, it's really not surprising if you create brutal conditions, people will become radicalized and just join a group fighting back. Like, we all understand it when it comes to US foreign policy, when we talk about Afghan and Iraq. But somehow when it comes to Israel-Palestine, people act like that's a hot take or something. But anyway, that is how I broke out of my support for Israel. But I genuinely think, compared to the US, the prioritization of secularism is something that makes a lot of people support Israel in the UK, because that's how we view the issue, especially since 2001. It's, you got Islamists versus secularists. And a lot of the argument I see people make, oh, well, in Gaza, they probably, throw you off a building or something if you're in the LGBT community, or if you're a communist, they'd absolutely hate you. Where in Israel, you'll be all right. And I think it also, what it did is seriously downplay how much religion still factors into Israeli society, because you get this whitewashed version where Israel was created by atheists and socialists, so therefore it was all about a homeland for the Jews, but not as religious as it might seem on the surface, but totally doesn't talk about the religious factions in Israeli society, which at the moment are actually driving government policy because Netanyahu relies on them for his actual support to stay in power, right? You don't learn that. So it becomes this binary thing of West versus Muslims, Islam, everything like that. So that is why I supported Israel, and that's how I broke out of it. And the only thing I would say is, with my rhetoric against them, which has become stronger over the years, because I've gone back and watched a couple videos of mine on this channel from 2019 to now, I've felt the same way about it for a long time, but I tried to keep my rhetoric less inflammatory because I was trying to convince people to come to my way of thinking a bit. It wasn't necessarily a very conscious tactical choice. But for example, I've recently started comparing Gaza to the Warsaw Ghetto. And I wouldn't usually do that because I feel like it's quite inflammatory sometimes when you're trying to talk to people in Israel or people who might support it. But then there comes a point where it's just no, that's literally what it is. We're literally watching it right now. It resembles 1943. It resembles this exact event in Jewish history as well. And I have to point that out because it's so ironic that they're doing this to another group of people, right? And I don't really care to do this argument a lot because I don't think it's as relevant as some of the other stuff, but also talking about, the claims that this is some sort of land back, all the Jews who went to Palestine after World War II are the indigenous population of Palestine, which is literally absurd anyway. But even if they were, literally if they all were, it doesn't justify what they did, right? But they weren't, and they still aren't. I could literally convert to Judaism, and I could get Israeli citizenship if I get the right rabbi to write that I'm sincere in my beliefs and stuff, right? And then my children can become Israeli citizens. Is that some sort of land back indigenous thing? Like a random Irish guy converting to a religion and getting to go there and steal someone's home or something? So yeah, like, as I've gotten older, I become more outspoken. But you guys will know, like, I've always been outspoken about this. My whole channel, go watch me talking about this Jeremy Corbyn stuff from like 2019, 2020. I've always been doing it. And I just feel like as the rhetoric ramps up on one side, I feel like more emboldened, I guess, to call out the whole ridiculousness of this country in the first place. And people often say, as a, like, trying to paint me as some sort of racist, oh, you hold it to a higher standard than other countries. I don't hold it to a higher standard. Israel's the same as the US, Northern Ireland, New Zealand, South Africa, Australia, Canada. The difference being is they're doing some sort of speed run of settler colonialism where they're trying to achieve what America did in like 200 years, or maybe even longer considering it's still doing some of this stuff as well, in about 70. And it's doing it with complete support of all our political parties and our government. Like, my taxes are directly funding this, right? So that's why I call it out stronger than other things, not because I have some sort of problem with Jewish people. And also something you realise as well when you get older, a lot of people who actually support Israel don't actually like Jews at all. Christian Zionists definitely don't. A lot of people in our own government who push conspiracy theories like cultural Marxism, like our Home Secretary, she's calling people anti-Semites now. Not that she's spreading it herself in literally her whole political career. Tommy Robinson supporting Israel because they hate Muslims. Like, you realise just the absurdity of it and how you do have to be some sort of Western chauvinist racist to support this country. And you could be like myself. I just think I was ignorant, naive, too brainwashed by new atheist rhetoric that I couldn't see how hypocritical I was being. A lot of people in the US especially are just completely conditioned to support this, right? And we're seeing right now the rhetoric of the early 2000s against like Iraq and Afghan is coming back in full force in the US especially, right? And settler colonial nations tend to stick together. But both our politics in the US and the UK are completely captured by this support for Israel. And I wouldn't argue it's all the Zionist lobby and stuff, although it is in some regards, especially involving the left, Labour Party and the Democrats. But you also have the foreign policy establishment who love this country existing because it gives the US a very good ally in the Middle East. And you also have these fundamentalist Christians who love it as well because it's part of Armageddon and prophecy and stuff. So you have that real toxic mix there. But basically the most dangerous thing they do is conflate anti-Israel sentiment with anti-Semitism. Because like I said, you don't want to start pushing that stuff. Because if you start pushing that stuff, you're going to create a lot of ignorance around this issue where people are going to start thinking the actions of the state of Israel are the true face of Judaism. Which, although someone like Netanyahu might tell you that, you don't want to start doing that because it's going to add to discrimination and it's actually dangerous to start doing this. Imagine if Islam was a very small religion and it had like maybe one major country, right? And it was doing terrible things. Let's say Saudi Arabia is the only prominent Muslim country. And then you start criticizing the Saudi government saying what it's doing in Yemen is terrible. And people start saying, you're Islamophobic. You clearly hate Muslims, don't you? If you have a poor word to say about Saudi Arabia, you know, the country where Mecca's in. And then if you start telling people all criticism of these actions is against Islam, then they're just going to start thinking, oh, well, I guess Islam is terrible then. So yeah, this is going to backfire massively. You don't want to start conflating these two terms, but because people in the US and UK are so obsessed with power, like in the UK, Keir Starmer is happy to push this because he's weaponized anti-Semitism against the left. So him shutting down all criticism of Israel as racist or something, it benefits him politically. But it's a dangerous game to be playing because fundamentally it makes Jewish communities in Western countries far more unsafe from anti-Semitism. But yeah, that was my experience from going from a, you know, relative Israeli supporter to someone who's like firmly pro-Palestine and realizes what Israel is, right? But the one thing I'll end it with is, like I said, I barely even thought about Israel growing up. And that's because we're not taught about it in school. We're not taught about Palestine really even existing before Israel. Yeah, sure, you might learn about the Balfour Declaration. You might learn a bit about the Ottoman Empire's decline and World War I. But you don't really learn about what was even Palestine before Israel was there, right? And Jeremy Corbyn actually proposed that we learn a lot of this history if he became Prime Minister. And of course, all the British people went mad saying, oh, self-hating Englishman, how dare you? But I think it would be very helpful because most English people don't realise the role of the British in creating so many of the issues in the world today. So much stuff we should learn about, but we don't learn. So if you're wondering, if you're maybe Palestinian, like, oh, why does the UK support Israel so much? Hopefully I outlined it for you, but hopefully I also outlined we support Israel because we're literally just taught it's the default, basically. It's a status quo. We're not taught about anything to do with Palestine, really. Most people in the UK have no clue whatsoever. And also, I will say they have no clue about Israel whatsoever as well. They just associate Israel with World War II. It's some sort of collective guilt thing. And basically everything it does is in defense of that never happening again, as they say. And most British people just accept that, right? And also, many people pointed out, settler colonial nations don't like taking a stand against colonialism because it points to hypocrisies in their own policies. For example, if the position of the British government was, you know, settler colonialism is bad and occupation is bad, they're literally still occupying part of Ireland right now. So you can't really do that. And it helps if you convince your population that's actually okay. Like, in certain regards, that sort of colonialism is fine. And that's what they do with Northern Ireland as well. So anyway, that is it for the video. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments. And if you made it this far, thank you for watching.